What's up, your boy Vaughn? Another reaction. In today's video, we have why was this guy slapping MMA fighters by MMA on point? Make sure to come subscribe and let's get into it.
These days when my life doesn't just consist of continuously crowning Bob. These days when my life doesn't just consist of continuously crowning Bob Sapp UFC heavyweight champion on UFC Undisputed 3 time and time again, I've instead found
I gotta get them shits. I don't get them.
myself losing a worrying number of hours to the never-ending void of short
I got a jailbroken PS3. I need to put them shits on them Undisputed games.
form content. Yes, I do need to know who the current welterweight power slap champion is, mum. It's important to me. And every now and again, in and amongst all the incredibly avoidable concussion-based entertainment that my algorithm seems to absolutely convince I
Dude, what the fuck?
crave, something genuinely funny will swipe onto the screen. And I'll stop for a second and I'll think, yeah, alright, I do want to know about a New Japan Pro Wrestling event from 1995 where Sting, bleach blonde and full babyface, looks like he's genuinely fearing for his life as a former two-time world kickboxing champion Tony Palmore is actively trying to kick his head off. And
But this a wrestling match. What the fuck?
as these axe kicks are just thudding into the back of poor old Sting's head, and he's scrambling around trying to block punches and somehow piece together actual pro wrestling offense in what is supposed to be a pro wrestling match against a man who...
Yeah, this is a pro wrestling match and this nigga throwing real kicks. What the hell? This is a wrestling supposed to be scripted. This nigga is throwing real kicks at this man and really punching him.
only knew how to throw real strikes. It got me thinking about all those moments where wrestling as an industry just couldn't help itself and tried to push past its own illusion and prove something to itself, to the audience, and to everyone watching. Because take Antonio Inoki, for example, this incredibly famous Japanese pro wrestler, and there's footage of him already well into his later years just slapping the shit out of Lyoto Machida. And you sit there thinking, what exactly am I looking at here? What is the goal? Why is a 60-year-old man open hand striking an elite fighter in the face? Is this about keeping up with MMA as it explodes into popularity? Is it about trying to cash in, or is it something a bit more personal than that? Like the ego of someone who built their entire life around being perceived as a legitimate tough guy, suddenly being confronted with a world where that can be tested for real. And somewhere between Sting sinking in the Scorpion Deathlock and Inoki handing out slaps like life advice, I thought, yeah, this probably turns into a video somewhere. I'm Tom from MMA On Point, and this is Why Was That Guy Slapping MMA Fighters? By this point, you've probably heard the story of Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali more times than you care to remember. It's one of those fights that every combat sports channel inevitably
Yeah, he started in New Japan, I'm pretty sure.
circles back to. It's this bizarre clash of sport, spectacle, and confusion that somehow left Ali dealing with the very real consequences. But it really is the best
God damn, look at that nigga chin. God damn. The nigga chin.
place to start because it captures the question at the center of all of this.
That nigga like a meme.
How does something that's supposed to be controlled, even predetermined, end up having very real consequences, and how much of that comes down to Inoki himself? So, Antonio Inoki, protege of Ricky Dozan, essentially the man who built Japanese pro wrestling from the ground up. He rises to fame in the 1960s through JWA, teaming with Giant Bubba, becoming massively popular and a genuine star, but the foundation of all of that isn't success. It's actually a pretty rough start to life. Because although he was born into a wealthy family in Yokohama, his father dies when he's just 5 years old, the family business collapses not long after that, and suddenly the stability of his life is gone, which eventually leads him and his family to emigrate to Brazil when he's just 14. And even that journey is marked by loss, with his grandfather passing away along the way. So by the time he actually arrives, he's not just in a new country, he's actually dealing with grief, displacement, and a completely different reality. And that reality is hard labor, working on coffee plantations, dealing with isolation, and the physical strain of it all. But at the same time, this is also where he builds himself up. It's where that physicality, that toughness, that endurance all start to take shape, and eventually that's what catches Ricky Dozan's eye and opens the door into wrestling. Through all the turmoil and everything that he's had to struggle through, wrestling comes in to save his life. Anyway, let's fast forward back to Antonio Inoki's wrestling career. After Ricky Dozan's death, things get a little complicated for him. Inoki tries to take control behind the scenes, but that doesn't work and he's actually forced out of the company. And instead of just fading away, he builds his own thing, New Japan Pro Wrestling. You've heard of this. Massive wrestling company. And this is where his philosophy really starts to take over, because Inoki doesn't just want to be the top guy in a scripted sense. He wants to be seen as the toughest guy, full stop. And the way he goes about that is by constantly bringing in legitimate fighters from different disciplines and putting them in the ring with him, blurring that line as much as possible. And sometimes it works in terms of spectacle, sometimes it just looks completely ridiculous, but the intent was always the same, to reinforce the idea that he wasn't just a performer, he's something more than that, he's a fighter. And even in that Sting example from earlier, yes, because Inoki was in that tournament, he wins the whole thing anyway, because, well, of course he does. The problem is, once you start messing with that line between performance and reality, it doesn't always stay under control, because pro wrestling relies on trust, on cooperation, on both people being on the same page, and when that breaks down, especially when you're dealing with people from completely different fighting backgrounds, things can turn into real fights very quickly, something which both Ricky Dozan and Inoki himself were just notorious for.
Damn, he's stomping on it at your head. What the hell?
Ironically, all of this ends up influencing the creation of actual MMA promotions in Japan. A new generation of Japanese wrestlers growing up with Inoki's mixed match spectacles branched out, created their own promotion, the UWF, which in turn inspired these proto-MMA organizations such as Shuto, Pancrase, and Rings, eventually all leads to the creation of Pride FC. So, in trying to prove wrestling's legitimacy, Inoki indirectly helps create something that doesn't need to pretend, something that is actually real. Which brings us to the late 90s and early 2000s, where MMA is no longer this experimental thing. It's becoming a fully realized sport. And instead of stepping back, Inoki leans further into it, putting his own wrestlers into real fights to try and prove a point that probably didn't need proving anymore.
Oh, hell no.
And of course, as you can imagine, the results are pretty rough. Yuji Nagata is probably
Niggas got built.
the clearest example of this. Someone who'd done everything right within New Japan Pro Wrestling, climbed the ranks, won the G1 Climax in 2001 after years of falling short, finally reaching the top of the mountain, and instead of capitalizing on that moment in pro wrestling, he gets thrown into a real fight with Mirko Cro Cop. And as you can imagine, it lasts 21 seconds and it's just brutal. He gets his head kicked off.
Oh my god.
It's after that that's kind of pretty mad. He unbelievably gets sent back in, this time against Fedor Emelianenko, and it goes pretty
Oh hell no.
much exactly how you would expect it to go. And you know what? It's not just him. This becomes a pattern. Wrestlers getting matched up with trained fighters and more often than not getting completely outclassed. Choosing Thunder Liger in a nice little outfit gets matched up with Minoru Suzuki and just kind of gets guillotined in a couple of minutes. Then of course you get Bam Bam Bigelow, who gets smashed to pieces by Chemo of all people. Alberto Del Rio also gets kicked in the head. He's wearing a mask as
Alberto Del Rio.
well. It was all just a strange time period of throwing in your favorite action hero into a slaughter. I mean, sometimes you did get exceptions like Shinsuke Nakamura, who was able to use his
Damn, he did this too?
MMA credibility to elevate his wrestling career. He went on to obviously have amazing success in New Japan Pro Wrestling, becoming one of the youngest IWGP heavyweight champions of all time. But those are exceptions, and the gap between the two worlds became more and more obvious as the time went on.
I'm going to inject the WWF with a lethal dose of poison.
And this idea wasn't limited to Japan either, because over in the US, Vince McMahon also started experimenting with this same idea of legitimacy bleeding into pro wrestling presentation during the late 90s. And one of the clearest examples of that was the arrival of Ken Shamrock. At the time, Shamrock wasn't just another
that nigga was Jack.
signing, he was coming in with genuine credibility from both Japan and the UFC, and he was seen as one of the most dangerous men in the world. And the WWF wasted absolutely no time in presenting him that way, debuting him in early 1997 as the special guest referee for the now iconic WrestleMania 13 match between Steve Austin and Bret Hart. And that's such an important detail, because they didn't just ease him in, they didn't stick him in some sort of throwaway segment. They put him right in the middle of one of the most important matches of the entire Attitude Era. The double turn that redefined both Austin and Bret, and Shamrock is just right there. He's in the middle of it, presented as this volatile, legitimate enforcer who could snap at any moment, and it immediately tells the audience that this guy is different. I mean, look at him. He's looking after himself, let's just put it that way. Now, when it actually came time for him to wrestle, it did get a little bit more awkward, because his in-ring debut against Vernon White didn't exactly light the world on fire. They kind of did this MMA exhibition, and it
What the fuck?
kind of fell a bit flat. The audience were kind of like, what are we looking at here? But ultimately, the WWF really did see some value in it. So instead of totally abandoning it, they leaned into it in different ways, like creating things like the Lion Dens match, which was essentially this hybrid cage fight environment designed to make Shamrock feel like he was still operating in this world rather than just kind of fully adapting to traditional pro wrestling. Of course, as time went on, Shamrock did kind of just adjust, and he did become more of just a pro wrestler. But that initial presentation, that idea of a legitimate fighter stepping into this world and bringing something different with him, started to bleed into the wider product. And this was really shown with bringing guys like Dan Severn and Steve Blackman, who were also kind of carving out roles based on that same perception. So you would think, looking at that maybe the lesson had been learned with Shamrock, that there's a way to blend these worlds without going way too far. But then, obviously, because of WWF and it's Vince McMahon in that kind of classic pushing everything too far era, here comes the Brawl for All.
What's the story behind Brawl for All? How was it originally pitched to you? Roll of the eyes.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because this wasn't just some random experiment. It was just very clearly designed with an outcome in mind. And that idea, at least internally, was that Dr. Death Steve Williams, this absolute monster of a man with a reputation as a legitimate tough guy, especially from his time in Japan, as his success over there was absolutely beyond anything you'd ever seen from any foreigner in the Japanese wrestling system. And the Brawl for All, well, he was supposed to kind of come in and win the whole thing. And then he was supposed to be positioned as this unstoppable force on WWF television, almost like they were trying to manufacture their own real fighting style within the company. So instead of just presenting him that way, like they had done with Shamrock, they decided the best way to prove it was to actually have him go in there and fight people for real. Which already feels like a massive gamble when you think about it, because now you're not controlling the outcome anymore. You're relying on reality to cooperate with your booking, and of course it doesn't. Instead of steamrolling the competition and becoming this legitimized killer, Williams gets knocked out by Bart Gunn, tears his quad in the process, and in one moment the entire plan just collapses in
God damn, bro.
on itself. Because now, instead of creating a star, you've completely derailed the guy you were trying to push, and the person who actually wins the tournament doesn't fit the role you had in mind anyway. So
this was real. They really had a real boxing match for wrestling, bro, for WWF. What the fuck?
just kind of throw him in to get knocked out by Butterbean, which might be one of the nastiest boxing KOs ever, and it happens in a wrestling ring. So just like in Japan, it just completely backfires, because when you try and force legitimacy in a real environment,
that nigga Vince was doing anything.
you don't get to decide how it plays out. So you got all of that going on. And the mad thing is, back in Japan, Inoki doesn't adjust either. If anything, he just doubles down. And over time, it starts to damage New Japan Pro Wrestling. The brand, it just becomes confused. Big talent started leaving and the crowd started to drop off. And Financially, they got a little shaky, enough so that even Inoki tried to sell his video library in 2002 to Vince McMahon. Ultimately, this was all blocked by the TV station anyways, but I guess the question in all of this is, had Inoki always wanted pro wrestling to return to its origins, to that carnival era where competitors competed for real, or did his own ego with predetermined accomplishments genuinely blind him to the reality of what his legacy was? As one of the greatest entertainers there ever was, a man who inspired millions, but had a vulnerability to ever show any kind of weakness, real or fake. So the infamous Inoki slap, the two-cone beater, it kind of sums up all of this in a weird, slightly absurd way. It didn't start as some grand symbolic tradition. It was actually in reaction to getting hit a little too hard in a bizarre showcase of Inoki's washboard abs. Students were being invited to the front of a class to legitimately strike Inoki, and after a particularly...
This Inoki nigga thought he was Superman or something. Nigga thought he was a Vultramite. Nigga thought he was Nolan, Omni-Man.
Stiff strike by one of the students, Inoki, clearly and momentarily stifled, reactionarily open hand slaps the student, and quickly replaced with a smile. One could actually argue that
What?
This moment, the legendary origin of the Inoki slap, was just a mere anger-filled reaction to a student half his size cracking the armor of Japan's greatest hero on national television. So the two-con beater evolved into this tool Inoki would use in matches, often to wake up a fighter, to ignite their fighting spirit, to show the audience that no one can take him lightly. It was part performance, part of a way of asserting dominance without ever really going all the way into destruction. But you can also see the human side of this too. Here's a man whose childhood was defined by loss, defined by grief and constant physical trials, a man who learned from a young age that the world was cruel and that survival required toughness. That early need to prove himself, to assert control, to respond when challenged never really left him. And that slap to that student, in a way, it's the distilled version of all of that. It's a moment of physical assertion and a sign of authority, yes, but all of a sudden you can also start to see a man who has internalized this struggle so deeply that the line between performance and reality almost didn't exist in his mind. So with a pro wrestling record of 2,107 wins and only 148 defeats, Inoki retired at the Tokyo Dome in 1998, defeating none other than MMA legend and UFC tournament winner Don Fry, geared up in gloves and all, via submission in a match that still blurs that line between reality and performance. He would later sell his majority stake in New Japan Pro Wrestling in 2005 to Ukes in order to fend off hostile investors, and probably just escape the embarrassment of his ultimate failure. So when you look back at everything, the slaps, the crossovers, the insistence on proving something over and over and over again, even when the world around him had clearly moved on, it's hard not to come back to where it all started, as something that was forced onto him early, through loss, through instability, through having to endure situations that demanded both physical and mental toughness just to get him through. So when MMA comes along, this fully legitimate version of what he spent decades trying to represent in a pro wrestling ring, maybe it's not just about business or ego. Maybe it's that to him fighting was never supposed to be separate from any of this in the first place, and that need to blur the lines, to push things further than they probably should go, isn't just about proving wrestling is real. It's about holding on to something that for him maybe always was. So yeah, while Inokiisms still pop up every now and then, whether that's Cain Velasquez
I forgot this shit happened. What that nigga name is? Cain Velasquez.
stepping in
That's the nigga that he knocked Brock Lesnar. No, he beat Brock Lesnar ass.
the WWE ring, or Randy Orton getting absolutely brutalized for the sake of realism, one thing's for certain. I think there's a ton of MMA fighters still out there with absolutely no idea why an elderly pro wrestler was slapping the shit out of them. Someone I like to slap the shit out of is the man who helped me edit this video, Luke Taylor. Go check out his YouTube channel, Charlie and Luke, for insightful gaming commentary and more. Also make sure to like and subscribe and comment about how much you lose your life to screen time.
Oh, that's a chud. Make sure to comment, subscribe, and I'll do see you.